Welcome, class, to week 2 of 517. This week, we're going to be discussing research methods. And you might think to yourself, this is not a research course. Why are we discussing these? Well, it's because everything we're going to study later in the semester, all the theories, all the strategies involving teaching and classroom management, are all based on researchers and what they've discovered about learning and about students. So it's important to understand at least the basics of some things about how they carry on their research. We're going to talk about 4 different types of research: experimental, correlational, descriptive, and action research. Each of these types of research will be either quantitative, having to do with numbers, or qualitative, having to do with words or language. And so this will become clear in a few minutes when we talk about these. First, let's talk about experimental research design. Experimental research studies are studies in which participants are assigned to an experimental or treatment group. Sometimes you might hear them called treatment or experimental, or a control group, and an intervention is carried out, and the effectiveness of the intervention is measured. So currently, researchers in the medical field are rushing to design and come up with a vaccination for COVID, for the COVID virus. And you might hear in the news that these experimental studies, in these studies, people are being assigned randomly to either a treatment group or a control group. The treatment group is getting an actual dose of the vaccination. They don't know it, and usually the person giving them, the researcher, doesn't know that they are getting the actual dose. And the control group is getting a placebo. And they don't know that they're getting a placebo, and the researcher doesn't know they're getting a placebo. This is called a double-blind study in the medical field. It means neither the researcher nor the participant knows whether they're getting the treatment or just a placebo. The reason that these studies, and they're considered the golden standard of research, the reason that these studies are so highly valued is because if you know that you're in one group or another, that can actually affect the outcome. It can, for example, create a sense of wellness in the medical study that might actually have a beneficial effect if you know that you're getting the vaccination, for example. In education, we have these types of studies too, although they're a little harder to do. So, for example, in an educational study where a student, they want to test the effectiveness of a reading curriculum. Participants will be randomly assigned to either receive the new curriculum or they'll be in the old curriculum, and that would be the control groups. Usually we don't do this student by student, we do it by classes. And so when random groups are assigned instead of individuals, that's called quasi-experimental. It's a good way to infer causality. So what does that mean? Well, if we can rule out that other factors, such as knowing that you have received the treatment, or other factors having to do with grouping and versus random assignment. If we can rule out other factors creating or causing a change, let's say the vaccination works, and we know it works because fewer people got COVID, or those people had the antibodies for COVID, then we know that the vaccination brought that on. If we can't randomly assign people or groups, and we can't use a placebo or a control group, we don't know, we don't have anything to compare them to. So suppose instead just everybody got the vaccination. Well, we wouldn't know how many people would have gotten COVID without the vaccination. So it's important to have that control group in an experimental research design. Another type of research is called correlational. Correlational studies are when researchers study existing variables to see if they are correlated. So let's say you want to know if the amount that you read to a child influences his or her age at which they start talking. Well, you could study these two variables, the age at which they started talking the amount they were read to, and see if one goes up, does the other go up? If one goes up and the other goes up, we say that the variables are positively correlated. If one goes up and the other one goes down, we say they're negatively correlated. So the amount of time you spent studying for a test would probably be positively correlated with your grade on that test. The more time you spent, the more likely it would be that that your grade would improve. However, let's say the more the more you the exercise, perhaps your blood pressure would go down because you would be becoming healthy over time. That's said to be negatively correlated. Sometimes two things are not correlated at all, and so you can't see a pattern there. Unlike with experimental research designs, you can't use this to determine causality. So we see this all the time in research. We say, oh, if we read to our children, they talk earlier. But what if something else was causing them to talk earlier? Some other factor not connected to reading to them at all. I like to give the example. Suppose I say to you, height and knowledge are correlated. Well, you might think to yourself, that's crazy because it doesn't necessarily follow that um, taller people are smarter than shorter people. And yet they are correlated because we know that the taller you grow from becoming an infant to an adult, the more you know. One's not causing the other. What's causing you to gain more knowledge is brain development. But it is a fact that height and knowledge are correlated. So you see how you cannot say that height causes your brain to, or you to have more knowledge. So we say that when something has a correlational research design, you can't say that one causes the other, like you can in experimental designs. Another type of research consists of descriptive research. And these are studies that describe something that already exists. You're not trying to study the effect of a change, but you're trying to document what already exists. So, for example, think about if you take an opinion poll survey. Your opinions about a matter already exist, and a survey is one way to find out what your opinions are. We call that descriptive research. It's not trying to change anything. This type of descriptive research is frequently used to understand settings or characteristics. Action research studies are carried out by educators in their own classrooms with a practical end in mind. So let's say you are teaching science, middle school science, and you notice that girls are lagging behind in interest. And you theorize that it could possibly be because they are, um, at this age, perhaps more serious about it than the boys. So you decide to try a little experiment where you group girls together instead of grouping them with boys and boys together and see if that makes a difference in students' grades and girls' interest. And so that might be a little action research study you could carry out in your own classroom. You're not doing it with thousands of students, and you're not doing it to document or show the effectiveness of something to the nation or to your state. You're just doing it to see if it has an impact in your own classroom. Teachers do this type of research in their own classroom all the time. Now, in addition to these types of research studies, you have two different categories of research: quantitative versus qualitative. Quantitative, as its name implies, focuses on numbers. It focuses on numbers to calculate averages, ranges, probability, and statistical significance. It seeks to prove or disprove a hypothesis, and it usually gathers numerical data through different instruments such as tests or surveys. So an example of a quantitative study might be this curriculum study that I mentioned earlier. You wanted to see if one reading curriculum makes a difference in students' learning achievement, and you measure students' reading achievement Before the study, you implement the curriculum and then you measure their reading achievement in the form of numbers after a study. That would be a quantitative study. Another, you might take an opinion poll survey where you asked how much you agree or disagree with a series of statements, and the researcher might assign numbers from 1, strongly disagree, to 5, strongly agree. They're collecting numbers to represent your level of agreement. That would be a quantitative study. Qualitative studies, on the other hand, focus on words and understanding experiences of participants. They do not seek to prove or disprove a hypothesis, and they are usually gathered through interviews, observations, and more. So, an example of a qualitative study might be if researchers interview a set of participants who have been through a change in a curriculum. And this time, instead of being focused on whether their reading scores went up, you might ask them about their perceptions. Teachers, for example, their perceptions of the curriculum. Another example might be if you observe students' behavior in a classroom and you're taking notes and you're writing down all your observations. In a sense, your fieldwork experiences are qualitative observations. So they're a type of qualitative research that you're doing. So again, quantitative focus on numbers, qualitative focus on words. Here's another example. A researcher wants to understand the experiences of rural female high school students who come from poverty but who hope to get scholarships to study science in college. He interviews 12 girls and looks for common experiences, motivations, and backgrounds. She writes an article publishing her findings. So would this be quantitative or qualitative? Well, if you thought qualitative, you would be right, because the researcher is using interviews, the data gathered are words, and they're looking for common experiences. How about this one? A researcher wants to understand whether male or female students are more motivated to study science in college. She designs a survey that asks participants to rate how motivated students are. She uses statistics to calculate how boys and girls rated themselves. She writes an article publishing her findings. What would that be? That would be quantitative because she's assigning numbers to levels of motivation. That's it for this week's lecture. In class this week, we'll be talking about the application of some of these research designs, and we'll be talking about other things as well. Check your README document to make sure you've completed the activities in this learning module before coming to class.